because of the screen, I imagine Iram is prepared to talk to us.
Thank you. Thank you, Iram Farah, Community Development. So we sent out a sort of an FAQ to the board, and there are copies on the windowsill for anybody who doesn't have them. So this was quite exhaustive, and our my goal today is to just fill in the blanks where we hadn't provided information and said that we would come back to you today. We're just bringing that information today. And I'm intending to not walk through this whole thing, mercifully. But if you have any questions, please let us know, because we're happy to answer those, or can bring other folks next time. So. This is actually partly to add to one of the questions that we did respond to, which was about why development hasn't happened, why there hasn't been more development and more change in Central Square over the last couple of decades. And we had talked about just the ownership and the parcels, there's the development pattern there right now. I think this image, which is property ownership and parcels in the area, just give you a picture of how hard it would be to develop in this area. I think the last time we remember seeing something when we look at the parcelization pattern that looks like this. It was in the other part of Cambridge, it's in Alewife, in the quadrangle, where everything's really broken up and a lot of different owners. So this is it makes it tough when you have so many owners and parcels are small, and property owners own parcels that are separated from each other, for instance, like here and here, so you can't have coordinated development opportunities, really. And then the next piece of that is what is built out already right now. So this is, the numbers here are the FAR of the parcels as built right now. The darker colors indicate higher FARs, and the lighter colors indicate show lower level of development, which means there's more capacity remaining on the lighter colored parcels and less or none in the darker colored ones. So where you see right now in much of this district, for instance, the FAR is 2.75, so where you see anything that's 2 or over, we know that there isn't really under current zoning any capacity on those parcels in the existing zoning. So we tried to make a little more sense of the two versions that I showed to you. And here we've pulled out the large property owners in the area, even if they have parcels that are separated in space. So each color here indicates a single property owner, and we've listed the top 10 here. As you can see, the bulk of the property in the quadrangle is owned by MIT.
In the triangle.
In the Osborne Triangle, yes. What did
you said quadrangle.
Quadrangle,
oh,
sorry. Any geometric shape. The greens are the city ownership. Up here is the intercontinental parcels where they have buildings on these two parcels, and these are our parking lots. So this starts to make a little bit more sense to us. And then we did the same thing with the FAR map, and we said if we were to look at all of the parcels that any one entity owns, what is the average FAR, or what is the FAR averaged over the cumulative ownership? So actually, I guess if you look at this parcel, I mean this map here, it's 2.75, that's permitted on the Kaiser site, and this site has 3.75, or here it's, actually this site. And then we go back here and we look at the overall FAR on MIT's ownership. and it's 1.76, which means that if you think about coordinated development, then there is, over multiple parcels, there is more ability to make change than if you look parcel by parcel. But one of the confounding elements in Central Square is the historic resources. And you had, I guess I'll deviate a little bit to respond to one of the other questions that we hadn't responded to, which is, or we have partially responded to, which was, how does the historical component of the zoning correlate with the map? And so we've worked with Historical Commission to do this, where they're still doing their final confirmation to make sure everything is captured correctly. But the zoning references contributing buildings, which are highlighted in the dark blue here. And those are the buildings that are, well, the hatched areas are actually the historic, the designated National Register of Historic Places historic district. And those, you can see there are several districts that either are in or part of the overlay, and some pretty close by. So those are all, the dark blues are all the contributing buildings in the historic district. The zoning also references buildings that are identified as contributing buildings by the Historical Commission. And that's the part that they're still kind of trying to make sure they have the right set. But here are the ones that they've identified, the kind of grayish, lighter blue ones. And in the zoning, they would be treated separate, the same way, even though here they are, in terms of their designation, they are different. So hopefully that helps those two pieces square together. And in terms of looking at the soft site analysis, which I'll just go back to, we were looking at the FARs by property owners, and then we overlaid this historic resources map on that. And it's not that there can be no change when there is a historic structure, but it just makes it a lot harder. So, and in the levels of review are greater, and you can see, you can imagine this is the Harvest building, for instance, soon to be H Mart. This is identified, but it's possible that the back part of it may not be considered as valuable, and somebody may be able to build on the back there, but it's, there's no assurance that that is possible, and so we've just laid this out. So this really is, I'll add the purple pieces here. We added the buildings that are either permitted and under construction now, like the Pfizer 610 main buildings, or the ones that were that were built in the last 15, 20 years, which is 15 years, which is Holmes Trust Building, the Central Square Theater, and the Night Stage Building. So we think that those are unlikely to change as well, just because they're newer buildings. So again, when you look at this, you realize how complicated that scenario for change is. But like I was saying about this building, there's still some possibility. And what, again, lighter colors here are the ones that have greatest potential for change. Now, this shows up as within the lighter zone because it's under 2.0 right now. This is the intercontinental parking lots, which we all think of as wouldn't it be great to see something other than parking on those parcels? But it's a lot more complicated in reality than it looks on the map, because that parking is satisfying the required parking for these buildings here. So it may not be as straightforward to see transformation on there. Similarly, you know, this the U-Haul building, the U-Haul site, which is a smaller site, which we may not normally think of as a big possibility for change, but that building, maybe we could have had a version of this that showed buildings that are very old or not high-value buildings, which may have had greater potential for change. So that may have made something like the U-Haul site pop a little more as possibly ripe for change. So, so that's kind of the complex picture of Central Square. that we think is that when you think about soft sites and where changes are likely to happen. So there is the picture of this.
The historic buildings, so are there some that simply cannot be touched, or is it simply there's a 6-month or a year's demolition delay on them?
There are, gosh, they're not showing up separately on this map, but there are a few buildings that are landmarked buildings that are probably as close to sacrosanct as possible. But for the rest of them, there is a review process at Historical Commission. It's harder, it's very complicated and hard to change them, but there are certain situations in which Historical Commission may either allow demolition, but more often allow some way of synthesizing an existing, a new building in combination with an existing building. But it just, even if it's allowed, it complicates the process of design and construction. So then you had asked us to take a look at a sample site and talk a little bit about what are the possibilities, development possibilities on the site. So we zoomed in on the site I was talking about a few minutes earlier, which is the one that has the Harvest Building. And so it's Essex, Mass Ave, Norfolk Street, and Bishop Allen. It's probably one of those complicated sites because it has, one owner owns 2 parcels. The Vega family owns 2 parcels on this site, on this block, which is what we considered as the site. But it's also abutting 2 city parking lots. There's historic structure in between, separating the 2 parcels. These 2 buildings are owned by 2 separate entities. So sort of a typical Central Square block. And we just wanted to list what our assumptions were. These go through uniformly across all the scenarios we're looking at. We always assume that parking is below grade, that floor heights for residential are 10 feet, commercial are 12 feet. Now we could quibble about what they really might be, but this is just for uniformity's sake. The inclusionary bonus is factored in all cases. But we haven't factored in any FAR exemptions for ground floor uses because it was just too complicated and will likely differ by site.
Also, they're not enormous numbers.
And not mandatory. Right. So we didn't assume that there would be any land assembly. So for instance, we could say, oh, they'll buy these 2 parcels, but we didn't assume that. We also assumed that historical buildings would be left on the site and not demolished and reconstructed. And I just want to point out, these are very diagrammatic and do not include any architectural refinements, really. So here we go. We looked at 2 scenarios under existing and 2 under proposed zoning. One version maximizes residential and the other maximizes commercial, and you could have something that does a mix of the 2. So this scenario looks at maximizing residential. And again, if you look, these are the 2 parcels that we're looking at. We looked at roughly 65-foot depth for residential in all cases. And so you would, under this scenario, get roughly, including the inclusionary bonus, you're getting roughly 56,000 square feet on this site and about, on this one, and about 46 on, actually, I'm sorry, I'm saying that wrong. 56 on this and 46 on this. And as you can see, this section, they're both pretty close to maxing out on the 80-foot height that's allowed right now. This one goes, they both go to 70 feet, and they do include the setbacks. So, then,
sorry, I have a question.
Yeah.
Below grade parking.
Yes.
subway goes right there, I presume.
Mhm.
Can you actually put the low-grade parking on a building that's fronting right on Mass Ave?
Subway, I think it's complicated, but they all have, many of those buildings have these, what are they called, Roger?
They have,
storage, like.
Yeah, or basements,
Basement.
go under the sidewalk even. So you can, it's just more expensive. You have to buttress it up really well.
And you'll also notice that, because of the dimension, you can have some remnant area shown in green, which could be treated anyway, whether it's open space or just some things. When you go to the commercial version, now the FAR is 2.75 passport, and so here you're getting 39,000 square feet of commercial here, and about 32,000 square feet here. And as you can see, you're quite far from from reaching the maximum allowed height in the district. But commercial can spread over the entire site, so you have larger floor plates, and you can see both sides can be theoretically filled up. Now, somebody may choose to do a different configuration and have a narrow building and go taller, which they would have the capacity to do. Switching now to the proposed zoning. So one of the things that the proposed zoning does is it allows the capability to do coordinated development over multiple sites. So you essentially can take all the FAR that would be permitted here and put it on the site as long as you're within the height that is permitted in the district. So this, you can see, maxes out the height and is roughly 170,000 square feet or so, a little less than that. And maxes out the 140 feet here. So again, somebody may choose to do, they could take part of this off and leave it there and have it in two pieces, but they could certainly do this. And once again, if you stack it all in one spot, you do liberate those areas to be open. It'd be much nicer versions of the parking lot, but with actually the open space. And then here's the version that maximizes the commercial square footage. You could fit most of the commercial allowance on the small site, because in this new conceptualization, we actually allow, unlike the formula that we use in the existing zoning, you allow the 1.25 to stack on top of the 2.75 commercials to get to the 4.0 maximum. So you see that you have a automatic mixed use that is possible when somebody tries to maximize the commercial. So here you're looking at about 75,000 square feet of commercial, of residential, and 72,000 square feet of commercial. My thing is dying, I'm sorry. So
Yeah,
thank you.
Isn't the floor plate illustrated, a 10,000 foot floor plate on the housing sign?
On which one?
On the,
This right-hand side?
yeah.
We actually just assumed the L to match the residential, but in theory it could be larger and then you could have maybe a roof deck above. But we were trying to think of, so here we just assumed this L and built down 2 floors of commercial. But here's where the bulk of the commercial resides on this side.
Can I just ask about the transfer of development rights maybe for a moment? Can development rights be transferred from any parcel to any other parcel? They don't have to be under common ownership or anything. They're transferable, tradable?
Yeah, so we have 2 provisions. One is the coordinated development provision, and the other is transfer of development rights. They kind of work together. So if somebody is doing a permit for these 2 sites together, they can move. It's similar to a PUD. They can move the density around as they wish and stack it on one side or leave it on the other or divide it in whatever manner. as long as they meet the dimensional requirements of the height and setback and so forth. So, but if it were different owners, or if it were from a site that is in the neighborhood edge district, I'll go to a map later, I don't have it in this presentation. But if you transfer from the neighborhood edge or donating district, then you would actually be able to get additional height. You wouldn't be able to get it if you're transferring amongst parcels within just the core area.
Well, first of all, when we say we're transferring development rights, is it primarily your permissible gross floor area
Yes.
that we're talking about?
Yes.
And so again, if it's different ownership, can you simply buy the rights from one parcel and that parcel is now subject to a restriction that it cannot build any more than whatever gross floor area it had left, after it sold all or some portion of its rights?
Yes, so that is the concept. We haven't really seen that happen in Cambridge, where I don't think anybody's been able to monetize what development right in a particular area is worth. So I know people in Alewife, where we also have such a provision, have been trying. There's at least one owner who's been trying to sell the development rights and haven't been able to make it work because I don't think anybody has been able to figure out what it's worth. So I suspect, the instances where we've seen successful use of the transfer of development rights is when it's with a single owner. So MIT, for instance, in Cambridge Port has used transfer of development rights to add to their dorm while creating the Pacific Street Park. So that's probably a good example of where it's worked. And here, the transfer of development rights provisions say that if you transfer out all of your density, you could either create a public open space, or you could get 0.5 FAR to do middle income housing. It has to be middle income. So, because both, from the committee's perspective, both were pretty equivalent in level in terms of the value to the community. So just to lay out all of those scenarios together, you could imagine that somebody would do a mix. These are showing up as all residential or all commercial. You could take this one and stack it here, or this one and stack it there, and create a mix, and that would, because in the existing development scenario, each parcel is acting on its own. Here, on this side, you would just be kind of reducing and increasing the commercial and residential, but you wouldn't. If you reduced this commercial, you'd be able to get more residential. So slightly different level of play in the two. And this is my final slide. You had asked about city ownership, so we just threw those locations onto that ownership map, so you can see what all we own in addition to the parking lots. And that's the end of my presentation. But I just wanted to see if people had questions either on this material or on the FAQ. We're happy to respond before I turn it over to Roger.
I just need one thing. You can clarify one thing for me with regards to the historical FAR. You mentioned potential and the contributing. What is exactly? How does the criteria of ability to contribute into historical? You're either registered or not, right? Like, I don't.
No, so these are actually historic districts. So if you look at this map, there's these hatched areas that are districts. So, and then you have this. This, for instance, is the Central Square National Register District. Here's the Urban Row Houses District, and or the Bigelow Street District. And within each district, when the Historical Commission makes the application, they have to identify all of the buildings that are contributing to making that district a historic district. So those are the buildings that are dark blue.
All right. Yeah. Thank you.
All right. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Roger to talk about design guidelines.
I don't know if everybody has guidelines from before, but I have printed out copies for you now. But maybe, I think the new members maybe didn't see the original presentation, and we got a couple of little modifications with the board's request subsequent to that. So I thought I would just do a really quick run through to refresh your memories. So the guidelines are meant for any projects in the Central Square Overlay District, and they're really an updating of the guidelines that we had originally done in 1986. As Aaron mentioned, there have been very few buildings built in the last 25 years, and that was one of your questions as to why that had happened. And I think it gave some sense of the complexities that have led to that. Some of the projects might be smaller, and they would not be coming for project review special permits, so those would benefit from having these more specific guidelines. The guidelines are structured much like the project review guidelines, and thinking back to 1986, we had very irregular reviews and guidelines, kind of sporadic all over the city, and now we fortunately have the consistent pattern of the project review permits, but still with more details in areas like Central Square. So we're looking at a series of guidelines that talk about how to meet several of the goals that the committee was very concerned about in terms of enriching the public realm of the square, dealing with the streets and sidewalks and how the buildings come together, and trying to continue to have a diversity of uses, and particularly ports of housing. In terms of streets and sidewalks, we've had a good bit of experience where we're starting to see spilling out of cafes into the sidewalk spaces that were widened. And people remember it was about 15 years ago, I guess, that we did the narrowing of the main roadway and the widening of streets, of sidewalks on both sides. I think that's been an extremely successful program where we've started having really active street life. Clearly that's something the committee wanted to see continuing. It's a similar theme to what we talked about in Kendall Square, of course, and across the city. This is trying to indicate that some of the smaller side streets that haven't gotten as much attention in Central Square, and one of the weaknesses has always been that even if we have a strong Massachusetts Avenue retail frontage activity, and we have a wonderful neighborhood just beyond that, a lot of these side streets have suffered from not getting enough attention. So we're hoping as we see redevelopment, we're able to keep in mind making those connections better. Clearly the T station and the Prospect Street Mass Ave corridor is one of the true focal points in Central Square, and where Main Street and Mass Ave come together at Lafayette Square or Jill Brown Lawn Park is kind of the other counterbalancing active spot. And this is an image of Carl Barron Plaza with the Homes Trust building in the background. It's been a kind of disappointment that this plaza hasn't been more successful or well loved by the community, but it's, I think, largely because we didn't get the ground floor retail that the board had hoped to see in this project. And I think we've learned the hard way that we've really got to focus on those ground floors and try to make sure we're getting those as active as possible. Then down at Lafayette Square, we're aware that the Twining Company is taking over the Quest buildings, and there's quite a bit of opportunity to get some more housing, ground floor retail down at Lafayette Square, where we already do have some success with Cafe Luna on one side and Mariposa across the street and Toscanini's. There's something to build on there, so clearly whatever happens in this area, we want to make sure we're building on that kind of retail strength. One of the things the committee was keen on was trying to think about some kind of a centralized space where community events could happen. This is an example from Chattanooga, but the idea is that if we're having some of these larger scale developments, would there be a way as part of the quid pro quo for allowing development to get in exchange a space that could have more of a public community space to it? Because if you think about Central Square, it is the heart of the city, and yet we kind of lack those gathering spaces. Ground floor design guidelines. We're thinking about clearly the amount of transparency at the ground floors, and again, we now start to have a lot of successes like the Flower at the Novartis building, long-standing Middle East, other cafes in the area that are having a good relationship to the street and things that we should build on as we see new projects coming along. Then under built form, we have tried to think about how to maintain a lot of what we've always looked for in height limits that would create strong street frontages and keep massing away from neighbors. And I think the idea that the committee worked out, and we've got in these diagrams that are impossible to read up here on the screen, but I hope everybody has a paper copy. The notion, though, is generally that we're trying to protect neighborhood areas by having setbacks and allowing for density more to be on main streets, particularly Massachusetts Avenue. And interestingly, our committee felt that our rigid 60-foot cornice line, 45-foot slope up to 80 feet was too rigid, and they said, why not let buildings go taller right on Mass Ave and let it be more urban? So we're trying to reflect that in these revisions. Wherever there's new massing, this is trying to show one block that might have a series of different possibilities about how it's massed. Wherever there's a frontage on Massachusetts Avenue, we want to think about breaking down the massing so it's not just a monolith, possibly get some sort of courtyards that are south-facing, kind of on the Mark Lewis Watson model, and just really trying to bring the urbanity to Mass Ave and leave lower scale back to the neighborhood. And this is a diagram that tries to show the height limit regime that is in place here with, again, the 60-foot limit generally with stepping back, but again allowing for residential buildings to go higher. And in terms of facade, we had quite an interesting discussion at the committee. Our old guidelines were very much predicated on trying to respect the history of Central Square, and I think we certainly want to keep doing that, but we don't want to be rigid about it so that we can think about the wonderful character of a lot of the historical buildings with more of a punched window feeling with in a frame of masonry or with interesting bays, but allow for something like the Mount Auburn Street building in Harvard Square, which is quite glassy and modern, as long as it's within a scale that fits into the streetscape. And the committee was quite strong on not wanting us to be too rigid in how we think about design review. And there are other examples trying to point out some of the great things in historic buildings, some of the things that get to be too bland, and some of particularly 60s towers. And just anytime we got a project, trying to look at the whole range of ways to humanize the project, always thinking about how to minimize the impact of parking and service areas. And then this is, again, bringing up the diagram of the historical resources in the square. And these red buildings, I think the question came up before, which ones are totally protected? Well, Steve, I think you asked that. This is City Hall. This is that building on the corner. This is a church. This is Oddfellows Hall. And that's the fire station. Those are actually the only actual landmarks that have been adopted by the city council. And those had real protections. And the others then have to go through the kind of review process that Dylan was talking about. So that's it for a quick overview of the guidelines.
Roger, it's great that you stopped on this slide. I have a question. Whether we're serious about the historic buildings here, and I know we all are serious about them, but is there a way in which anywhere in our zoning code or any code that we know of where those historic, the preservation of those buildings or the restoration or the incorporation of those buildings could offer a developer some kind of a bonus so we could incentivize retaining some of those heritage buildings?
Yes, in the original Central Square Overlay District, which was modeled on the Harvard Square Overlay District, we gave leeway for the board to grant relief if you're saving historic buildings for things like parking, setbacks, and that sort of thing. So we do have a certain amount. Is it enough to save a building? It could be in a tipping balance. And certainly the board has always worked very closely with the historical commission. We'll be having their hearings on any one of these buildings that's deemed really important. And there'd be a lot of give and take back and forth on that.
And Roger, we have pulled that provision in here as well.
So we still have that provision that has been in there all along. On the Holmes Trust building, there is a historic facade where the CVS part of the building is, and that was saved and incorporated into the building. Kind of not the most successful part of the building, but it was an attempt, and I think we can learn a lot from that project. The next time around, we'll have a lot of things that we could do better, I think. But that was one aspect of it.
It kind of looks pasted on now.
It does, yeah. It should have been done with a little more vigor.
We had a version of what you're talking about on North Mass Ave recently, where we tried to provide for allowing more density to preserve the older houses along North Mass Ave. But it's always a challenge because you say you can give them more density and allow more density, but how they can actually do it is another question. But we tried to do that up there with zoning. But we can look at, is there something you can do here that allows that many purges that?
Not to be totally negative, but is that the kind of thing that gave us the condo building across from St. James Church?
No.
It's more recent.
No.
No. That was an as-of-right project that went awry. That was not one of these things.
We can say
clarify.
So where do you think we are in the process? If the goal of the process is to have a petition submitted to the city council, where are we in that process?
I'll jump in a little bit. I think there's probably a need to hear more from interested parties. I think there's a letter tonight, for example, from Alex Twining, which I think is worthy of some discussion and analysis and consideration by the board. I think there are also additional members of the public who probably want to sort of weigh in and give their thoughts. So I would say there's probably some more legs to the discussion. But I would hope that with the questions that we've done, with the FAQs that we've gone through with these presentations, my hope would be that it would try to hone the discussion and sort of keep the momentum moving forward, I guess would be how I might phrase it. Is that enough of a punt?
That's not a punt at all, Mr. Chairman.
No, it's the big picture.
That's not a punt at all. I concur with you, Brian, and I think that this memo lays out, it's not a memo, it's really just a statement of what we've been talking about, and it clarifies all of our positions very well, I think. It's not a legal document, but it clarifies where we are and what we're thinking. And I think that we can use this to say, to help guide the rest of our discussion. Well, we don't really need to have a 2-hour discussion on that because we've really got some agreement here. We've really talked about that. That's been done. But there are new issues that are coming up. But I feel like what we have here is something to look back on and say, well, this is our collective work. And we're not going to open these up again and again and again. I feel like we are somewhere with this. And I feel like with the transitions that are happening with Twining and others, there's a lot more work to be done.
If I might just ask one question. There were a couple of questions that we raised in there. For instance, for instance, you had asked about, is the formula business provision too strong? And we've gotten a response that we felt, we talked beyond with our economic development folks who felt like it was okay because it really wasn't prohibiting formula businesses, but they did say if the board felt it was stronger than you would like, there is a version where we could have the review happen at Central Square Advisory Committee rather than at Planning Board. Is that something that you might prefer, or would you like to leave it as recommended? Similarly, we had asked about the glare from high albedo roofs, and we had said maybe we could put a design guideline in there, because it isn't just something that you encountered. As we looked at online, we found that this is actually a problem with the very big roofs, when people pick shiny roofs that you could act, but you have products that are not as problematic, so we could have something that guides people to that. So I think if we could get your guidance on some of those questions, and also I think it would be useful. I don't know, that it doesn't feel like we've heard a lot from the board, so if there are things that you feel are not resolved, it would be really helpful for us to hear those as well. Because this set, if you feel happy with these responses, then that's fabulous.
I was happy with your albedo response.
Oh, okay.
That was that addressed the issue and said, and it's my problem with all of this is that I don't understand what's going to happen after it gets passed. What are the physical changes that are going to be happening over, say, the next 25 years? And I would venture to say that even you don't understand that, because you've told us eloquently how difficult it is to understand the ownership. We now come up with a set of sort of incentives and that are trying to make it more likely that people will do things that the committee felt, and I think the committee was representative of a broad view, not universal, but a broad view, one that probably was not committee's view of it. I don't think differs much from ours, but I'm going out on a limb there, because I think you're right, we haven't churned through it. But it's like, what's really going to happen? And is it going to be like the Illinois plan of 1980, where nothing happens, except David Vickery got a permit for a building that we ultimately took away? The only time in my 25 years on the board that we actually revoked the permit, which was a Grace site permit for 1.5 million square feet of commercial development and thousands of cars, which didn't happen because of other reasons. I mean, anyway, I'm not going to go there. Is this the practical response? Now we got a letter from, as you said, from Alex Twining, which I just received today for some reason that didn't get into my inbox at 4 o'clock this afternoon when it got into other people's inboxes. But and I see Michael sitting out there representing or listening here for a large landowner. Everybody's an influential part of the decision-making team over there. In a way, I want to say, well, let's take all of this, and now let's sit down with Alex and say, okay, let's make a deal. Okay, what do you really want to do? We know what we want to see happen through this process. Let's make a deal. Let's come up with a concrete plan that says buildings here, green space there, public market there, parking there, and then we'll sit down with Michael and do the same thing with Michael, and we'll go through those top 10 folks on your list and make sure. We'll have sort of like the old days where you would have a master plan and there would be green things and buildings on it. everybody wants us to do this, right? To come up with a plan. And we resist it because we don't think that's the way things really happen in the city or in this environment. It's not because we're strange, it's just like we understand the way developments happen. They don't happen by a planner saying, put a tower there, put a park there. So that's my difficulty with moving forward on this. You know, I look at the design guidelines, and these are the right issues, the right responses. I don't think you get into the zoning, although it's quite complicated. It's not a huge change. I mean, it's saying, okay, we continue to want to protect, you know, Bishop Allen Drive and the residential neighborhoods north. We're not making changes to that. We're saying we want people to build housing, so we'll see if we give them some right to build it. But it's got to be pretty, and it's got to fit within other guidelines. We'll try to make it easier, as the thing that you showed us earlier, the study, which I'm sure was not done with any cooperation with the landowner, was just saying, okay, this is what the landowner, these are the options he might face. And these are the kinds of responses. There was at least one picture there that I said, oh my God, I wouldn't want that to happen.
Could I respond a little bit?
Yeah.
Been 34 years looking at Central Square and have seen the few things that have changed in that time. I think partly, I'm not hearing anybody say we want huge change in Central Square. We'd like things to get better. Heard a lot about the parking lots. And earlier on, whenever we didn't think about the parking lots all that time, but earlier on, if we said we might do something on the parking lot, I heard immediately from the business people, don't you touch our parking lots. We're not hearing as much of that this time. And certainly the committee was saying, yes, parking is a resource, but it's not the best possible thing we could imagine happening on these lots. So in my view, if you let those lots be thought of more seriously for development, it's a different matter. It's still not going to be wholesale redevelopment. I don't think that makes sense, but I do think a few slender housing towers that bring more people in, that are more tied into the whole community on all levels could be a good thing. And one of the things that some of the committee members want to see is zero parking for new housing. I mean, and certainly the board has been pushing for less and less parking, and we haven't gotten to zero, but we've got a lot of sites where there's a lot less, and this is right on top of our best transit system.
When I was on the zoning board many years ago, we granted conversion of a non-residential building to residential with zero parking. Mm-hmm. I think of it as the Singer sewing machine building. I'm not quite sure. I guess that dates me,
but I guess what
Mass Avenue and Pleasant Street? Not Pleasant, I mean Pearl. Three-story high building. It's got some small apartments in the top 2 floors.
Well, I guess what I'm trying to say is it seems to me that a few good things very carefully done could be a big help for Central Square. Wholesale redevelopment, I don't see how anybody wants it or it's likely to happen. But some change certainly is likely to happen as we see pressures that people are worried about coming from Kendall towards the square. And we have the example that Tom gave us of the rent structure in the office buildings being so high now, it's kind of shockingly high. There's a lot of energy wanting to happen in Central Square. So my sense is that this zoning ought to be enabling good things to happen with enough constraints on it so it's not so much that we choke on it. You know, it's something. And I do think that things are changing, and generally, in my view, for the better, particularly having widened those sidewalks and seeing now we take for granted we've got active street light and so forth, but there's a lot of places that could be better. So it seems to me incremental change it could be a good thing, and that might be the 25-year fix.
Mr. Chair. Central Square, I guess, differs in my mind in a couple of important ways, and Roger referenced the parking lots. There's an awful lot of city-owned land in the area that we're considering for rezoning here. So it is a little different in terms of what the possibilities are, depending on what city government's attitudes are in terms of jump-starting something, either by trading those development rights, as were described earlier on in the presentation. So I'd really like to have some discussion and understand about what the possibilities are there with the sizable publicly owned spaces within the district. Now I know that Mr. Twining's memo arrived late today, but I at least had a chance to look at it and read it, and it raises some questions that I'd like to air amongst the committee, because it suggests that there may be ways in which we're memorializing things within the proposed zoning which won't actually come to fruition because of basic development economics. Now, whether or not his point of view is correct, I don't know, but I'd sure like to get to the bottom of that. You know, are we actually disincentivizing moderate income housing, which is what that paper argues in substantial portions of it. So those are a couple of the issues I'd like to air amongst my fellow board members.
I definitely agree with that. I think that the Twining letter raises a number of issues which may already have been discussed by the committee, and which is a problem I have with the whole process, which is when we've had discussions, we've heard the committee's sort of consensus point of view, but we haven't heard, you know, sort of alternative points of view, or what the oppositions were and why the committee came down with the position they did come down with. And I'm not saying what the committee said is right or wrong, but it's just sort of like, I don't feel like I've had enough information of the pros and cons of each point of view to say, well, this is why we ought to go with this. And it may be all the things that are raised in the Twining letter were already discussed in great detail, and the committee came out with a decision that maybe Twining doesn't agree with, and maybe what the committee came out with was the right decision. But I just feel like I don't have enough data to try to reach some conclusion. And I again, and you know, the staff fact memo was fabulous. It really just honed in completely on what we had asked about and provided lots of information.
But in addition, there was also questions that were raised at the public hearing. We're part of that.
Right. And I too am concerned about, you know, with so much historical property, you know, what really can occur. We've heard a lot of the public talk of, you know, fearful about, you know, dozens of towers going up, and I think the reality is no. Maybe in the best case you're going to get 2 or 3 towers someplace, and so a clearer understanding of that. And also I agree that the one thing that the fact memo didn't really address is the possibilities for the city land, because it seems that really is a major issue. And if you're talking that you can put underground parking, well, you know, the parking lots could become something like Post Office Square, you know, Park in downtown Boston, which was a horrible above-ground garage, and now is an underground garage with a fabulous park on top. So, you know, maybe there is some way to have the parking and a park, or this, you know, community meeting house center we'd like to have. Or maybe there's, you know, city-owned housing tower built on top of it that, you know, accomplishes some of our housing goals. So I think that's an important piece that we haven't heard enough about.
I would just add to that the idea of putting the parking underground I think I want to explore not just what happens if the city lots, but if the city were to invest in underground parking, would there be an opportunity to consolidate some of the privately owned lots in that same area? I know that, for instance, the Intercontinental lots are serving their zoning minimums, and obviously they want to preserve that. But if there is a jointly owned parking garage that is a public-private partnership of some type, is there an opportunity there to even create more opportunities for development?
Since we're talking about parking, I think parking is an interesting piece of this. I certainly have no problem requiring underground parking for any new development. But I'm interested and a little bit concerned about losing the public parking spaces. The Post Office Square is a great, a beautiful example of urban development, but if you want to park there, it's going to cost you $30. I'm not sure that everybody who uses the public parking at a big lot off of Bishop Allen are prepared to spend $30 to do their 1 hour of shopping in Central Square. So in part, I guess I'd really be interested, if it were possible to do so, to do some sort of survey of actually who is using the public parking lots and what businesses are they frequenting, and who would be affected, what businesses would be affected by the loss of that public parking. People are concerned about gentrifying, and I think the notion of putting underground expensive public parking here really could contribute in an undesirable way to that gentrification. The other thing is, as others have said, I like the vision that this zoning has, but as Hugh originally said, it's not at all clear to me what would come of it. It's more of my question, as I expressed last time, publicly and privately, is the pragmatic question of does it, as a practical matter, create enough incentive for existing property owners to do anything? And if in fact our goals are very modest and we don't really expect a whole lot of development, and in fact don't want a whole lot of development, then that's great, because I don't think we'll get a whole lot of development. People have said they'd like to hear more about what could actually happen. I think it's a really hard thing to figure that out, because in order to do that, you really have to do a fairly complex, in-depth development pro forma on these lots, figuring out land acquisition costs and construction and other development costs, and what the potential rental income or sales income is. And it's a fairly elaborate matter, and it's kind of difficult for any of us board members, or I suspect for any of the staff, to really perform. When Mr. Twining suggests that changes be made in the zoning because as currently structured there isn't enough incentive to develop, he may be right or he may not be. I couldn't and wouldn't even react to that without actually seeing pro formas. I think for anybody, Mr. Twining and others who suggest that changes need to be made to encourage development, the words are interesting, but not enough. I think we really want to see some financial analysis to support that premise. The only other thing I would add is the whole business of transferring of development rights. I think is really interesting. Again, it's kind of difficult to anticipate how it will play out. But I think it's interesting and maybe more powerful than we're giving it credit. I mean, we have a lot of these, as we've pointed out, small, difficult lots under separate ownership. And the traditional thing to do is for somebody to buy them all and assemble them and do something. But actually, you don't have to buy them all. You simply have to buy the development rights and accumulate them on another parcel. And I don't know how that actually plays out as a practical matter, but it does seem to open up interesting possibilities that didn't exist previously.
So, as you all know, I'm an architect and I specialize in multifamily housing. Over the last 3 or 4 years, I must have studied, 15 different sites. Developer comes to me and says, somebody wants to sell this piece of land. Tell me what I can get on it. And then I send my sketch and he sends it over to a contractor. The contractor says, this is going to cost $138,000 a unit, I think, or $210, or whatever it is. And then the developer runs a pro forma. He said, I think I can get so much for the twos here and so much for the ones. And the primary client manages 20,000 apartments in Massachusetts and owns 10,000 of them. They built over 50 years. So they've got a fairly informed idea. They never win these competitions because somebody comes along who is hoping.
Overpays.
And right, overpays. And sometimes they get them. I remember there was one site where they might get, like it was offered to them the first time, and they said this is what it is, and then somebody else got it, but they couldn't do it. Then it went to somebody else, and couldn't do it. So this is all really in support of your statement that trying to determine what is financially feasible is very important to somebody who's going to be borrowing tens of millions of dollars and spending their time doing this. And believe me, the people who are lending tens of millions of dollars are very, they put a great deal of scrutiny into these things. So, can we evaluate those? I don't know. I remember a discussion 25 years ago at this board on that very subject. And Paul Dietrich and Fred Cohen saying, we shouldn't require these things because we won't be able to know whether they're actually, there's so many assumptions in pro forma, we don't have the skill to know whether these are the right assumptions and to be made. The developers don't think they have the skills. They sometimes do, and they get it right sometimes. Sometimes they get it wrong. So, yet that's at the core. If you're trying to say, well, are we creating the right opportunities? So, another thing I want to comment on is when the city disposes of a piece of property, it's not like somebody goes into Bob Healy's office or Rich Rossi's office and says, hey, Rich, can I buy this apartment lot for $2 million? I think at this point, does there have to be a competitive process for all land dispositions? And then there's a process that the planning board participates in to determine if it's in the city's best interest, from our point of view, and many people do that.
I mean, that's the closest that we can come to trying to work out a quote-unquote deal. Always makes me nervous to hear that word in the planning board meeting. But, being that the city owns the land, it can structure a deal that would get some of what we want, and obviously I think that would be some goal. I wanted to add one other footnote, if I could, to the question of can we require things, or is it going to put the developers out of business. You remember when we did the initial affordable housing requirement? There was all kinds of testimony, this is going to shut down housing in Cambridge. And it didn't happen, so you also have to take some of these things with a grain of salt.
Yeah, I would comment on that one is that had nothing else changed, that might have been true.
True.
But everything else was changing.
Yeah.
And so, and you have, and the changes that were out there were things that were foreseeable. So we were kind of assuming that the development market was getting better, rents were going up, and that there would be the ability to have projects self-subsidize certain units. We would kick in, essentially give them extra land by increasing the FAR, and that would be enough, plus the economics, and it's, as you said, it's proven itself. And somebody else talk.
Mr. Chair? I wanted to add to this discussion, and there is a lot of wisdom at this table. I think this board has a history of working closely with proponents who come to us and with developers and listening to them and listening to their perspectives and being respectful of their perspectives. So I think that works in our favor of what's going to happen in Central Square. There's never going to be an exact roadmap that says here's the line you're going to take to get there. My perspective has always been that the public sector can set preconditions for success, preconditions for economic success, but we better stay out of the development business. We don't know how to do that, and we can only muck it up. But if we just focus on what are the preconditions, what are the things we can do based on our relationships with the proponents, based on our relationships with staff who knows these things, what are the preconditions, and then we just back up and let it happen.
Just a few things, Hugh, that I think consistent with what folks have said here, the committee especially said they did not want to see wholesale changes, more sort of here, there, not everywhere with the towers. And then our sense was that working with Billy Clancy, that we were calibrating in that direction. And understandably, we weren't going to have an exact job and couldn't know the private details of private transactions and be able to get it pro formas. But we do have the experience of seeing, as you do, what responses have been to existing FARs around the city and existing FARs in areas like Kendall Square or L1. So we have sort of sense of relativity to sort of what prompts action and what doesn't prompt action, or what, as Roger said, what has not prompted action in Central Square over the years. So it's not without some sense of that in a relative fashion, but not to the details certainly that you're talking about in terms of, you know, that someone's going to make this amount or that amount of money in the project.
I also want to, today on Facebook, I got a feed from Robert Winter's journal, and he walked around Central Square, took about 20 pictures, and said, and it was a very simple and very convincing exercise. Here's something, doesn't seem to be very distinguished, it's not very tall. You know, here's a place where something might happen. I think it's actually a very valuable analysis, and it's sort of behind probably what other people were doing, but I would encourage you to visit Robert. You can probably tell them what they have to Google to get it, but it put it into a different way of understanding. And you'd say, you know, there would be like a little site, and you'd say, yeah, you have another building here, and you could say, okay, well, that's not going to be Alex 20. We had pictures of Alex 20 sites, but, you know, it's like, the guy who owns that would, you know. I mean, one thing we found in Harvard Square when, in 1986, there was a sort of there was zoning of Harvard Square, it didn't actually change the permitted floor area ratio. There it is. What's interesting is that incrementally, Harvard Square has grown to look like the zoning of the There's some exceptions, but often the projects are quite small. But think of the old post office, say. That's not a very big building. It's like 40,000 square feet. Is a good place for it.
Robert, is there music that goes with this, or I could whistle if you.
While folks are looking at this, I just wanted to make one clarification. Some board members mentioned that they were concerned about parking going away. And I think that was not so much envisioned that the public parking lots, when they're redeveloped, that the parking would just all go away. The idea was actually what some of you said, that the parking would get either consolidated in a structure or be moved underground, which doesn't answer the question that Steve raised about who can afford to park there, because right now the city parking is well below market, and if it's below grade, it may not be able to be that way. I don't think we were able to look at utilization. We actually did survey that. We can even get license plates and have an intern go take down all the license plates, but we can't then connect easily to economic brackets and who those people are or where they are going to shop. We did have an intercept survey.
You can look at the nameplate on the car. It's like or a Toyota.
Give them a discount if they fill out a questionnaire.
We could try something. I think it's hard, but we may be able to get some samples. And I think just one thought on the committee's work and the difference between Alex Twine's thoughts and what the committee talked about. And I think the difference stems from the fact that when Alex is looking at this, he's looking at Kendall Square and Central Square, and how do those two compare, and how are the incentives structured in both places. Whereas when the committee was looking at this, they were looking more at what's Central Square zoning now, and how might we be able to incorporate additional incentives into it to get to the end results that we want. So we weren't trying to compare to the rest of the city or to, and that maybe that was a failing of the process, because the market flows throughout and not just in Central Square, but in terms of trying to create incentives in that particular area. That was one of the core differences.
I think I'd also just add to the discussion about sort of the difference between the narrative and the numbers. We've also spoken some with the economic consultant and the sub-Divinity plan scene. I think I'm going to try to see if I can get some additional work to sort of hone in a little bit more. But sort of the overall approach, and this is, I think, more common in both Maryland and Virginia in terms of how some of the things are structured, is, you sort of do your work and your analysis as, with your consultant and try to come up with your best guess. And then at some point, if there's a lot more pushback, then you sort of require them to unveil a little bit more in terms of those pro formas to make that case, and just sort of go back and forth with the numbers. And ultimately, at some point, you sort of have an iterative conversation back and forth. You talk to other people who are sort of in the same industry, or developers who are doing things, to sort of get an honest sense for sort of where things are going. And at some point, you get it as close as you feel comfortable, and then you end up having to sort of make a decision that says, okay, depending upon what that gap is and where things are, we're going to sort of take a leap of faith. And the consultant's general advice is, if you're close, stick to your guns. Because, maybe you have to wait a little while, but you probably get there. Now, if you're farther away, then you have to sort of relook at things. But that sort of was her general advice and sort of approach of how to try to take a look at it and think about it. But to make sure that you really are thinking about what is it that you're willing to do in terms of your trade-offs. I mean, I think that's sort of, in many ways, as you described, this a lot of the challenge for the board, which is to figure out how do you put how do you figure out what we're comfortable with for Central Square? What do we think we can get if we unlock it? And at some point, you might get to a point where you say, well, we know we could unlock these benefits if we were to, say, do, I don't know, an inordinate number of extremely high buildings, but we're not willing to make that trade-off because that's not what we think Central Square is about. But that's sort of, I guess I sort of feel like it's a little more of an iterative process, but you're right, at some point there's a leap of faith that comes at the end of it.
I like the notion that you could set a consultant or a sub-consultant for the city and Alex Twining in the same room and let them bat heads, and they could have an intelligent discussion that might guide us.
Right, and I think that's right. I think that's exactly the kind of thing we're looking to try to do. And then the follow-up, I think, is for both the board, the public, and the council, frankly, to give up and have that consultant also provide a little bit more of an understanding of it, so that there is sort of a sense of here's what's possible, here's what's not, and here's sort of the range where we think something could happen.
Right, I mean, Alex's letter is 8 pages long with exhibits and photographs. It's not just about a single topic. So, is there more we want to do tonight? I don't want to hear from all.
Yeah. We have said a lot on the Central Square issue, but I wanted to add one thing, and maybe as a question staff or you on another. And what I would like to add is what the advisory committee that I see a lot of faces here tonight, as well as some of the landowners that were mentioned here, MIT specifically, are here, and Forest City and so on and so forth. And I'd like to hear a little bit of comparison of what happened in Alewife in the 1980s and the permit not being used, or to put to use, as opposed to, I like the notion that this particular permit will work because the advisory group that I was part of and the business owners in the area, as well as some of the parents and land owners, came together and put this together to better Central Square. And I just sort of like to hear somebody to compare the two, as opposed to what happened in Alewife. I mean, I would hate for this to go to waste on one end. And quickly, I would also put in what Central Square lacks is, in addition to what we talked about, and it's probably in there too, is green space. The only place that we have now for green open space park is in front of the City Hall, and you can see a lot of people now sleeping, and little children rolling around, and so on and so forth. So one of the park and underground parking that we're talking about, maybe it's the one right behind where the Blockbuster used to be. One of the great ideas would be to make a park, a green park, but, you know, a little alleyway connecting to Mass Avenue and things of that sort. But that's just an idea.
In response to your Alewife question, one of the things that happened in that the Alewife plan that did not result in most development using the special permit was that the base allowed as of right was very high, and developers found that they could actually do quite well operating underneath the threshold for a special permit. And since that time, we've learned from that, and actually what you do as of right in almost all throughout the city and subsequent rezoning has been made quite a bit lower, so that you would feel comfortable with what happens as of right, but the encouragement is there very much to step into the special permit and the planning board process. As to the parking lots and open space, I think we agree, many agree that is one of the key things that they look for, you know, as an outcome, a possible outcome of the involvement of the parking lots. I think that's one of the things we see as one key way that outcomes can be directed for Central Square is the city's involvement with that.
Because I would answer that question this way, that I think one reason there hasn't been too much change in Central Square is that it actually works pretty well. You know, people who own property are getting a return on their property. The businesses are, there are not very many vacancies. And, you know, people, if things are sort of going along okay, you know, there's not an incentive to change. and maybe the Harvard Square is the better example, where there were much stronger pressures. A lot of the development in Harvard Square has ended up, the commercial developments ended up as office space for the university. Who would have thought that most of University Place would be university? And that the law school alumni affairs is like the big tenant, above the post office and that kind of stuff. But so the university hasn't been acquiring the property, but they've been, Harvard has a statement, each tub on its own bottom. Well, each tub also sort of tries to grow a little bit, and so some of those tubs grew into private space, and I think the savvy developers felt like, I can go and build a building because sooner or later Harvard's going to come to me. And I mean, that's not to say that all the buildings are full of Harvard, but some of them are. The retail and the restaurants expanded considerably, so the ground floors stayed pretty full. Whereas in Hillway, we've finally seen the first glimmerings of people who actually want to do something up there. Maybe 1,500 units of housing isn't exactly a glimmering, but we tonight permitted the fourth or fifth major project permitted out there, depending on whether you count, say, the one that's across from the T station or not. But is that going to be the future of the? It's clearly the future of the triangle, because it's. But is it going to be the future of the quadrangle? Might be. Certainly, you've got half of Fawcett Street. In Kendall Square, there's an enormous desire to do things, and you have to basically say to the landowners, you can't build your biotech building unless you build some housing. And we've been saying that now for quite a while. And, we say to Boston Properties, we'll give you some FAR if you build housing. And it's going to eventually happen. And it might end up with 600 units of housing if the places that the Kendall Square study identifies as potential sites. And it'll come at the expenses of parking spaces. Not a lot, but some. And shared parking spaces. So there are a lot of people who want to do a lot of stuff there, and you can say, well, if you want to do X, you have to do Y. And savvy people, and I would count MIT as among savvy people, will say, well, that bigger picture does make sense. I mean, it's true we really want to do X, but we want our people to be happy, we want the retail to work, we want a gateway, we want, housing's not such a terrible idea. We have a lot of people who need to be happy. So, in Central Square, I think it's like, it actually works pretty much okay. And so what we're trying to do is look at some of the empty parking lots, look at some of the one-story buildings, look at the properties that Alex Twining has bought, and say, well, there are places where we could see some things, or as Robert did it in his pictures, there are places where you could imagine there could be changes that you might like to see. Anyway, it's 10 o'clock. My brain turned off a while ago, as it's wont to do. Is there anything else anyone wants to say tonight? Anything else you want us to do? We'll get back to this next month, I guess.
Thank you very much.
I mean, you've heard comments from